President Richard Nixon and Mohammad Reza Pahlavi were important strategic partners during the Cold War, working together to keep the Soviet Union from dominating the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, which was and remains a critical source for the world's energy needs. In a toast to the Shah at the White House in 1973, President Nixon said the following about Iran's place in the world. The words are timeless because they aptly describe why Iran is so top of mind for U.S. policymakers. This is what he said. He said, "When we think of where Iran is, its place in history, going back 2,500 years, its place geographically, where it is the bridge between Europe and Asia, where it is the opening to the Indian Ocean, South Asia, and also to the Middle East, when we think also of the very strategic place that Iran occupies in that critical area of the world, which many believe is potentially the most explosive part, the whole area of the Middle East, and the Indian Ocean, I can only say that those who want peace as you want it, and as I want it, and as all of us in this room want it, those of us who believe in peace, we are fortunate that Your Majesty occupies the place of leadership that you occupy today." Those are the words of President Nixon in 1973. Our distinguished speaker today is here to discuss with us Iran's strategic importance in the world, specifically during the reign of the Shah. Andrew Scott Cooper is an adjunct professor at Columbia University, a commentator on U.S.-Iran relations and the oil markets, and his research has appeared in news outlets across the world, including the New York Times and The Guardian. He's also the author of two very important books. One is called The Oil Kings, How the U.S., Iran, and Saudi Arabia Changed the Balance of Power in the Middle East. And his newest book, which he'll talk about tonight and sign copies of after this event, it's called The Fall of Heaven, the Pahlavis, and the Final Days of Imperial Iran. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to bring to the podium Andrew Scott Cooper.
Jonathan, thank you very much for your warm introduction. This is an amazing setting. It's very presidential, and any historian who was standing here would be incredibly flattered to be in this wonderful room. And I'm delighted to join you here this evening. Thank you so much for driving such long distances to come here tonight. Earlier, I had an opportunity to view the magnificent new exhibition space. The Nixon Library, the Nixon family, the Nixon Foundation, National Archives, and everyone associated with this wonderful project are to be commended for their efforts to preserve our historical record while finding creative new ways to make the nation's history accessible and relevant to a new generation of Americans. In the introduction to her Pulitzer Prize-winning history book, Stillwell and the American Experience in China, Barbara Tuchman wrote, "I am conscious of the hazards of venturing into the realm of America's China policy. Nevertheless, since China is the ultimate reason for our involvement in Southeast Asia, the subject is worth the venture, even though the ground is hot. And I think it's safe to say, judging by my barbecued posterior, that the ground is as hot today, writing about Iran, as it was for Tuchman 45 years ago when she wrote about China. There has been an intense reaction to the publication of my second book, The Fall of Heaven, which recalls the final days of Pahlavi-era Iran during the 1978-79 revolution. The book had been available in stores for only 3 days when my Amazon page was flooded with messages of personal abuse. Anonymous trolls accused me of being a CIA agent, a defender of right-wing fascist dictatorships, and an apologist for human rights abuses. When my laptop was disabled by a virus, I wasn't sure if it was coincidence or something more sinister. As a precaution against hacking, I felt compelled to close my social media accounts and I also had to cancel a scheduled trip to Iran next year. My employer stepped in and briefed me on the policies Columbia University has in place to deal with harassment, abuse, and threats. Now, all these things happened before anyone had really had time to read my book or fully digest its contents. And indeed, some of the people trolling me admitted they had not read it. I suspect they never intended to read the book. In fact, what they were reacting to was not my work, but instead a book review that appeared in the New York Times Book Review. The review was written by an American journalist of Iranian heritage. She decided I presented a far too sympathetic portrait of the late Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and that I was too critical of the Islamic Republic of Iran. In particular, my reviewer accused me of showing, quote, reflexive hostility towards Islamism, which is a particularly sweeping generalization and incendiary phrase to use against anyone at a time of rising sectarian and religious tensions. The reviewer did not inform her readers that in order to better understand Shia Islam as it had been practiced before the revolution, I had traveled to Iran to undertake a sabbatical to study Shiism at Al-Mustafa University in the theological city of Qom. Nor did my reviewer inform her readers that earlier in my career, I had worked as a human rights researcher at the United Nations and then at Human Rights Watch. In fact, my training made me more qualified than most to address the highly sensitive issue of human rights in Iran in the 1970s. Now, you wouldn't have known it from reading the Times, but my book was the product of a decade of research and scholarship that entailed travel to Iran, but also to Lebanon, Egypt, France, and several other countries. During my travels, I met with or interviewed more than 100 people. In addition, I located and analyzed thousands of new pages of newly declassified documents and many others that had never before appeared in print. Casual readers of the review could be forgiven for assuming that I had simply decided to sit down one day and write a book on the Shah because I felt like it. Now, this tells you something about the time we're living in. The book review was posted to the Times site on a Friday. By Saturday morning, the volume of abuse was such that my publisher intervened with Amazon and asked them to take immediate measures. Amazon agreed immediately, to their credit, and the issue was sent to the company's special committee established to monitor and respond to abuse, harassment, and threats against authors. I don't know if many of you knew there was a committee. I didn't know the committee existed, but we do have a committee in place to help people like me. But by then, of course, the review had gone viral, and by Sunday morning, the Jerusalem Post had carried a report that stated my book was causing profound embarrassment to Hezbollah in Lebanon. As you can see, things are getting worse. What my reviewer had done was misrepresented the part of the book that dealt with the disappearance of Imam Musa Saad, a prominent cleric who disappeared in Libya in August 1978. According to her, the book accused the late Ayatollah Khomeini of direct personal involvement in the disappearance of Musa Saad during the revolution. In fact, if you read the sections of the book carefully and closely, you will see that I lay out several plausible explanations to describe what may have happened to this man. But in Tehran, Iranian journalists began asking Musa Saad's family members if the accusation in the New York Times was correct. The next thing I knew, copies of my book were on their way into Iran via the port of Dubai. Clearly, some people decided that the book could be used to embarrass the Iranian authorities. Now, the words historian and contraband aren't usually mentioned in the same sentence, but I admit I was flattered to learn that my book was now in the same illicit category as crates of whiskey and blue movies. Without knowing it, I had in fact produced a work of subversive literature. Controversy sells. That's what I was told by my editors, my agent, and my friends. They congratulated me. You have achieved something very few historians have achieved: notoriety. But I did not seek out notoriety, and frankly, I was appalled to see myself reduced in the public eye to a caricature and my work completely misrepresented. I had spent the past decade working 7 days a week, long hours, and with great care to produce 2 books totaling over 1,000 pages. During that same time period, apart from undergoing spinal surgery for a spinal injury, I had completed a second master's degree and a PhD in order to develop a respectable level of scholarly expertise. The whole experience of this book release initially left me feeling dispirited. Yes, controversy sells, was my reply. But what about my reputation? What about my professional integrity? Even as I uttered those words, I realized that I sounded as though I had stepped out of a Hogarth painting from the 18th century. Today, when scandal is seen as the fastest way to the top, concerns about personal reputation and integrity sound positively elitist. Several weeks ago, the novelist Tamar Janowitz, who wrote The Slaves of New York a long time ago, was asked by the Guardian newspaper how she dealt with criticism and poor reviews of her work. But it's like Andy said to me, she said. That's Andy as in Andy Warhol. It's like Andy said to me, and he said it much, much cleverer. If I get a bad review, it's not what they say, it's how many inches they jab at you. Now, by Warhol standards, I felt I had been jabbed by so many inches, I was lucky to be walking upright. My book had taken on a life of its own before it had even been read. And the question is why? Those of you who know nothing or very little about modern Iranian history and are not of Iranian heritage might wonder, what is all the fuss about? The Iranian Revolution occurred in 1978-79, which to many of you is a lifetime ago. And the late Shah died in Cairo in 1980. In 1980, Jimmy Carter was president, the Berlin Wall was still standing, and the Bee Gees ruled the music charts. Millions of words, thousands of articles, and hundreds of books have been written about the Shah and the revolution. What was it about me and my book in particular that provoked such an intense reaction? Well, the simple answer, one answer, is that for Iranians, the revolution never really ended. For many, it remains an open wound and very much unfinished business. What outsiders regard as simple history, they view as deeply personal. Everyone has their own opinion about why the revolution happened and how it turned out. There are Iranians, especially on the intellectual left, who have never forgiven the Shah for his mistakes. And I suspect their criticisms can be partly explained as a response to my work. Yet almost 4 decades later, far more Iranians have grown weary of the black and white historical narrative that casts the Shah as the villain and Khomeini as Iran's great liberator from oppression. This was a narrative essentially shaped by the baby boomer generation of scholars who carried over the struggles and grievances of the 1960s and 70s into their scholarly work. They remain deeply invested in this narrative, and I think it is fair to say, have profited from it. That's just how it works. But that narrative is now collapsing beneath the weight of its own contradictions. Though my critics would have liked you to believe that I am personally trying to rehabilitate the Shah and the Pahlavi era, the fact is that scholars are only now catching up to where many in the Iranian community have been for some time. In the last decade in particular, many younger Iranians have become interested in learning about what life was like before the 1979 revolution. For them, the crackdown on the Green Movement in Iran in 2009 was a watershed event. It led them to question the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic. Stunned by the brutality of the crackdown that followed, many young people and students withdrew from active politics. In their search for answers to how Iran got to where it is at today, they became interested and began studying their country's history before the revolution. Now, I encountered this phenomenon myself 3 years ago when I visited Iran. Islamic scholars in Qom, in an Islamic university, told me that their students had so many questions about the Shah and the Pahlavi era that they felt obliged to offer special history classes to educate them on the faults and failings of the monarchy and especially the Shah, and to remind them why the revolution had been necessary in the first place. The literature on the Shah and the Pahlavi era was bound to change, if only because it had become stagnant. The first wave of books written about the revolution appeared in the 1980s and 1990s. They were written by political scientists, diplomats, former officials, journalists, and ideologues. Some were good, others not so much. Most authors reflected the orthodoxy of the Cold War period and almost without exception were harshly critical of the Shah's rule. Except for a few exceptions, these books and their authors portrayed the Shah as either an American puppet, as a bloodthirsty dictator, or as a weak and corrupt ruler who was completely out of touch with his people. Professionally trained historians tend not to get involved in historical debates until we are confident we have located new materials with which to write our own investigations and reach our own conclusions. So for a long time, most historians stood back. That started to change in 2009. Since then, several books have been published that seem to suggest the revisionist wave of literature on the Pahlavi era was finally on its way. The authors of these books were less judgmental and I think more sympathetic to the challenges the Shah faced in trying to modernize his country at a very difficult time. My first book, The Oil Kings, was published 5 years ago. Its portrait of the Shah as a staunch nationalist and hard-nosed negotiator with US officials, including President Nixon, shocked and intrigued Iranians who were used to the conventional narrative of him as an American puppet. Now, for the first time, with the help of the new documentation we had from the National Archives and the presidential libraries, they were able to gain a more nuanced understanding of the particular challenges faced by the Shah in trying to preserve Iran's sovereignty and steer his country through the treacherous currents of the Cold War. Some Iranians who had lived through the revolution refused to accept the book's scholarship. They considered it such a radical departure from what they had known and read about that they decided I must be part of some organized conspiracy to rehabilitate the Shah's image. For the first time, I began hearing rumors that a non-Iranian couldn't possibly have written such a book, let alone someone from New Zealand. And rumors began circulating that either I was a CIA agent or that the declassified US government documents I used in my research were elaborate forgeries produced by institutions such as this one. From writing about conspiracy theories, I became one myself. This is the ultimate accolade in a way. I always wanted to write a book about the Shah's last days in power. I was 9 years old when the revolution happened, and I still remember watching the crisis unfold on television in Wellington, New Zealand, where I grew up, and it left an impression. 9 years old, think about it. Think about what our children are watching today and how that's going to affect them later on. As a teenager, I read hundreds of history books. That was my shtick. Big books, the bigger the better. And I was particularly enamored with Robert Massey's Nicholas and Alexandra, and which I still regard as perhaps one of the best written and most evocative narrative history books of the past 50 years. The Oil Kings opened the door to the sequel that I hoped would take readers behind the scenes to help them understand how the Shah lost power in 1979. I also wanted to recreate what life was like in Iran, and especially Tehran, on the eve of the revolution. I thought younger Iranians in particular would enjoy learning more about how their parents and grandparents had lived before the revolution changed Iran forever. Like the first book, this one was also helped by timing, with the declassification of thousands of pages of new documents from the Carter presidency. So now for the first time we understand what US officials in 1978-79, how they were responding to the emergence of this crisis in Iran. And this is important. Now I imagine for some Iranians, I know for some Iranians, there is something strangely compelling in the spectacle of a New Zealand-born historian coming under fire for writing a book on the Shah of Iran. Some Iranians are surprised and suspicious, they tell me, so I know that this is how they feel, that a foreigner, and especially someone from as far afield as New Zealand, shows so much interest in their history. But you have to consider where I come from. New Zealanders have a reputation for curiosity about the world around them. Our personal interests often become obsessions, which may have something to do with the fact that not much happens in New Zealand. Fortunately, this has not been broadcast in New Zealand, I hope. New Zealand and its people tend to be very quiet, especially when compared to Iran and Iranians. But we live vicariously through you. We're also, from what I can tell, very single-minded people. I don't think it's a coincidence that a New Zealand mountain climber was the first to climb Mount Everest, or that a Kiwi scientist was the first to split the atom. Consider the bizarre contraptions invented by New Zealanders over the years. Egg beaters, hairpins, and referee whistles. Where would you be without them? Where would you be without us? We have a role to play. 7 years ago, a New Zealand teenager living on an isolated farm built the world's largest piano in a woolshed, with no help or instructions from anyone on the outside. Thanks to the New Zealander who invented the Zorb, you can now strap yourself into a giant hollow plastic ball and go spinning down a hillside at 50 kilometers an hour. Why wouldn't you want to do that? And don't forget we invented bungee jumping. Nor am I the only New Zealander in recent months to come under fire for groundbreaking investigative research. Journalist David Farrier's documentary on tickling, yes, it took a New Zealander to think that one up, has received critical acclaim, and there is even talk of an Oscar nomination for Best Documentary. He said he was sitting at his computer one day and he read a story about professional tickling. It piqued his curiosity and led him to investigate what turned out to be a whole underground culture of tickling. His documentary also led to a violent backlash from professional ticklers who were offended by how he portrayed them. You can look at this stuff. I'm not making this up. This is great. I feel your pain, David. Perhaps you and I can do an exchange. I'll take the ticklers off your hands for a weekend if you agree to host the gentleman from Hezbollah. I'm serious about that too. Rather than be offended or suspicious, Iranians should perhaps be grateful that somewhere down near Antarctica is a country whose entire population appears to have a serious case of OCD. But seriously, I believe that my status as an outsider, as a non-Iranian historian, has been more of a help than a hindrance. For a start, I see things that Iranian scholars have overlooked or perhaps did not think were significant. The issues I am interested in and the questions I ask are different. My training as an investigative researcher has also been a big help. Some Iranian intellectuals expressed irritation when I pointed out that many of my Iranian interviewees said they felt more comfortable talking with a non-Iranian scholar because they did not trust a fellow Iranian to fairly represent their views. But rather than castigate me, perhaps my critics should look at the way they conduct themselves and why this level of distrust exists in the first place. I think that blaming me is a distraction from the real issue, which is that some have grown too comfortable with a historical narrative that they would prefer to defend at all costs rather than revise or reconsider. But as a result, they have left the research field wide open for a new generation of scholars, younger scholars, who do not accept their frameworks or their explanations at face value. And why should they, when new evidence is emerging to challenge old assumptions? There is a role for the outsider in helping nudge the scholarship in different directions. It took an outsider to become interested in the Shah's oil policy and to start reassessing the causal relationship between turbulence in the oil markets in the 1970s and damage to Iran's economy. It took an outsider to ask questions about the Shah's relationship with Imam Musa Saad and to pursue an investigation into his disappearance. These are thoroughly Iranian stories, but why was I the first scholar to become interested in learning more about them? And why are my books widely read by the younger generation of Iranians? I don't think it's because I'm seen as pro this or anti that. To the contrary, what the younger ones tell me when they write to me is that although they may not agree with everything I say, they appreciate my commitment to researching and writing about modern Iranian history from a fresh perspective and with new enthusiasm and energy. Don't worry about the critics. One of them wrote to me 2 weeks ago, "You're a hero in our crowd. We love what you do." There's another issue to deal with, very sensitive one, and that is self-censorship. I don't have family or friends back in Iran, and I'm not constrained in what I say or write. Some of my colleagues I know have family in Iran, while others want to safely travel back and forth without fear of harassment or arrest. This shouldn't matter, but the regime in Tehran has made a point of harassing and even imprisoning dual national scholars and accusing them of acting against the interests of the state. Now, I make this observation not to offend anyone, but merely to point out that as a non-Iranian, I believe, and I have been told, that I have more freedom to maneuver. This is no exaggeration when we consider that researching the revolution remains a highly sensitive subject for scholarly discussion. That is because the stakes are so high for the winners and the losers. Let me give you an example. I was fascinated when I discovered documents that provided details about the money trail that connected the anti-Shah revolutionary movement in the 1970s to Colonel Gaddafi's Libya and the PLO's Yasser Arafat. We now know that in 1977, for example, the Libyan embassy paid the Iranian Mujahideen $100,000 every 3 months. That's $1977, every 3 months to buy such high-powered weapons as armor-piercing rifle grenades, assault rifles, and mortars to use against the Iranian security forces. Their Maoist counterpart, the Fedayeen, was supplied with Polish, Czech, and East German weaponry that included tungsten armor-piercing ammunition, machine pistols, submachine guns, and high-powered hunting rifles. This is 1977, before the revolution starts. Presenting this evidence does not detract from the fact that there was a high level of dissatisfaction in Iran in 1978. But neither can scholars now overlook compelling evidence that shows the level and presence of an organized foreign-backed opposition to the Pahlavi state. One of the reasons why I believe these groups mobilized against the Shah was in reaction to his decision to support his friend Anwar Sadat's search for a peace settlement with Israel in 1978. You actually had these two momentous events happening right at the same time. It's very fascinating from a historical vantage point. For the first time, I think it's safe to say that the unrest in Iran had an international dimension and that it was not a purely local episode provoked by domestic grievances against the ruling elite. Internationalizing the story of the revolution brings a new perspective to talking about the circumstances surrounding the Shah's downfall. In the book, I also detail the many acts of sabotage undertaken by foreign-backed terrorist groups in Iran, starting in late 1977, to undermine public confidence in the Shah and to provoke public panic. If we are to gain a fuller understanding of the forces at work inside and outside Iran in the late 1970s, this critical period, I argue that we must broaden our horizons and embark on new fields of research. Surely that is what scholars are supposed to do. This is an exciting time to be researching and writing about modern Iranian history. I have no doubt that my work will open the door for other scholars to write their own books. It's already happening. The criticisms directed at me are not unique and really were to be expected. After all, I'm not the only historian who has been severely criticized for revising popular assumptions about a revolution. In preparation for today's address, I researched the furor that greeted the publication in 1988 of Simon Schama's revisionist history book on the French Revolution. In Citizens, the author made the point that the Bourbon state actually did some things quite well, and that it was less repressive, more reformist, and indeed more open to change than previously thought. Shama directly challenged the 200-year narrative that depicted King Louis XVI as a dolt, his ministers as flops, and the French royal court as out to lunch. France, he said, had many good things going for it in 1789. He argued that a great deal of revolutionary violence was, in fact, and I quote, fired by hostility to modernization, attempted or proposed, than by the will to speed it forward. I think the parallels with Iran in 1979 are quite striking in that regard. Was the revolution for progress or not? What was the eventual outcome compared to what came before? For daring to challenge historical orthodoxy, Simon Schama was excoriated by his reviewer Norman Hampson, who wrote a blistering essay in the pages of, yes, you guessed it, the New York Times Book Review. Now, editors get nervous when authors write public letters to defend their works. They worry it can make us look defensive. But Schama felt compelled to write a letter of response to the book review. What really seems to make Hampson cross, he wrote, is my effort to use narrative as a vehicle for argument as well as storytelling. I admit that this does indeed fly in the face of academic convention, and I am not at all sure how well I have succeeded. But the assumption that this can't be done seems belied by the very passages Hampson cites as instances of my deplorable habit of seizing the reader's attention. I had not read Schama's letter before I wrote my own to the editors of the book review. Who decides what history is and what it is not, I asked, and who gets to write it? I wish I had thought up Schama's line about the power of narrative history writing. The Academy does not yield easily. And sometimes, on the question of narrative writing, it does not yield at all. Schama's sin, and I suspect mine, was to write an account of a revolution in a style that you, the people in this room, and my viewers at home could relate to and engage with. They know very well that we have a direct line to you through our work, and that we prefer to write for you rather than specifically for other scholars and the Academy. Ultimately, the intensity of the reaction to my book, as to Schama's book 3 decades earlier, is reassuring. It is a reminder that there is still an audience for what we do, that not everyone has been anesthetized by the vapidness of modern tabloid culture, and that above all, people still do care about their history. Look at the room we're standing in. I am a historian, and that means I am talking to you, listening to you, and I hope I am telling your stories with respect and sensitivity. I am an interpreter for the past. I am an interpreter of the past for the present. As a historian, I can also be a rebel, and sometimes, without meaning to, apparently I engage in a quiet act of subversion. But I am not a people pleaser. I do not write history books to make you or anyone else feel good about yourselves or the decisions you made at some point in your life. That is not my role. Libraries can be passive, dry repositories of books and documents, said President Nixon. I love this quote. He expressed the hope that his library would become, quote, a vital place of discovery and rediscovery, of investigation and contemplation, of study, debate, and analysis. The same can be said of the history profession as a whole. If we don't do the job we were trained to do, if we don't remain vital, curious, contemplative, open to discovery, willing to challenge and investigate, then we will have failed in our duty to the people. The controversy over my book has in some respects been a welcome reminder that in the world of Snapchat, Instagram, and Twitter, there is still a place for history, and that we historians still have the power to start conversations that some find too hot to handle and would prefer to just go away. I think it proved the events of this summer for me personally, that there are many, many people out there who care deeply about the past and who still have open minds and wish to seek out new knowledge to help them make informed decisions. They are ready to be challenged and inspired to learn in new ways and through new eyes. I want to thank you very much for coming out to see me tonight. It has been my great honor to stand here, to be here in the Nixon Library and Museum, and to speak with you about issues that concern us all. And now I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Andrew. Andrew has agreed to answer your questions, but I'd first like to announce that he will be available in the lobby to sign copies of The Fall of Heaven, which are also available in the museum store. I'd like to first start off by asking, how would Iran look different today had the Shah and his successors have stayed in power?
So Iran was on the road to, I think we would say it was on the road to Western-style modernization. And in my research, I was really struck, it was something I hadn't thought about before, but I was struck by how close the Shah was actually getting. I mean, Iran was actually much closer to this modernization than I thought, and that in essence, he's taken out just as he's getting towards the end of the road. And that's part of the big tragedy of the story. One statistic I was fascinated with was the number of computers in Iran in 1978. Iran had one of the highest per capita rates of computer use. That's remarkable when you think that the age of personal computing was just getting underway. But the Shah welcomed US corporations and US businesses to come into the country with new technology. I think the big issue is the whole region. And I think that now we would look back and say that the collapse of the Pahlavi monarchy and the Shah's ejection from power creates this huge power vacuum. And I don't think that power vacuum has been filled since then. And I think that many Iranians would probably agree with me on that. Also, I might add, many people in the Arab world would agree, because my conversations, I have spoken with people from Lebanon and Egypt who would say, you know, the troubles go back to 1979.
A question in the fifth row.
Thank you. After your quite lengthy story about the reaction of the book, I didn't hear a word, and I'm expecting to hear. So how did the Shah got into power, and how did he lost his power? I thought that was the crux of the speech tonight, which I came to hear.
So the Shah came to power in 1941, when his father was deposed by British and Russian armies, and the young son, the young king, comes into power at that point, and he's 21 years old. He loses power the story of how he loses power is in the book, and that's a very involved story. He leaves the country in January 79 after a period of unrest of about 18 months. So I won't get into the details of that because we'll be here for a long time.
I have a question right here.
Thanks. Do you see any parallels with modern-day Turkey at all?
Well, Turkey's an interesting question. I mean, Reza Shah, the Shah's father, was very inspired to begin modernization based on the Ataturk model. So what we're seeing now is the Ataturk model really under enormous pressure. And there are some interesting parallels, but there are some important differences too. The two countries are obviously very different, but we certainly see the counter-reaction, I suppose, to the modernization and secularization of these countries.
A question in the third row.
Would you comment on the contribution that President Carter and George Ball played in actually leading to the Shah leaving Iran and actually having no place to go during his sickness?
President Carter's role in the revolution. So the documentation that I located had some surprises. One of the surprises is that the president does not get involved until very late in the crisis, really until it's almost too late, it's over. And that miscalculation can be blamed on complacency in the State Department, complacency within the US Embassy, which was taking the lead role in managing the US relationship with Iran. President Carter, I think we would agree, I think Carter people would agree that this was a disastrous bungling. I mean, I think we could say that. Carter makes an interesting point. He said that his biggest regret as president, he did this in an oral history interview, his biggest regret as president was not firing Ambassador Sullivan when he had the opportunity to do so at the end of '78. But it was too late by then. I mean, it was far too late. The damage had been done much earlier in the relationship. As far as the Shah's exile is concerned, I mean, that's also, I think many people would say that was a shameful episode because the Shah and his family, as you remember, were traveling around trying to find a safe sanctuary. And they could not find safe sanctuary. And the person who finally allows them to come in is Anwar Sadat of Egypt. And I think one of the reasons why Sadat is assassinated is because he brings in the Shah and there is a reaction from fundamentalists within his own country.
We have a question in the back row.
Yeah, I think I remember reading back in the 50s that the CIA supported a coup d'etat and overthrew the democratically elected president of Iran, the Mossadegh, I think. Can you talk about that, put that in context?
So Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh was the Prime Minister of Iran from 1951 to 53. He nationalized Iran's oil. And there was, again, it's a sort of long story. The CIA under Eisenhower participates in the overthrow of the Mossadegh government. There's a very interesting scholarly debate going on right now about the circumstances of the extent to which the CIA-US role was pivotal or how much the Iranian role was pivotal. But Mossadegh is ousted. The Shah, during that time, left the country briefly for about 3 days, and then he comes back and he's restored to the throne. But at that critical point, it looks briefly like the monarchy in Iran is about to be overthrown. But the US, for various reasons, participates in that operation. And it remains, I think, an open wound for many Iranians. There's a very source of great controversy and contention. It's a fascinating story, and there's one volume of State Department documents related to that have been withheld for many years, and we're waiting for the release of that volume to help us understand what happened. And there is some speculation that the holdup is due to pressure from the British government because they were involved too, and they're concerned that their role would be exposed.
A lot of people are concerned with the fact that we made a nuclear deal with Iran, and what they're worried about is the fact that other countries in the region will be getting nuclear weapons, as of Saudi Arabia and others. And the present government, do you think, will they be looking to get a nuclear weapon soon? As soon as the sanctions are lifted?
I have to say I supported the deal. And one of the reasons to support the deal is to prevent proliferation throughout the region. Because, the fear was that if Iran comes out as nuclear, the Saudis will go, Egyptians will go. Look, this is sort of like it's a catch-22 situation because on the one hand, you want to stop proliferation. On the other hand, you have a regime that has broken many agreements in the past. And the best we can say is that I think the administration would say the best we can say is we have locked them in for a period of a decade, and we hope that that restrains their ability. Now, I see people in the audience who are completely not agreeing with that. And I think this was this is where we're going to have to wait and see what happens. But events in Iran may determine the future of the deal, not between the two governments.
We have a question in the second row.
Thank you. The question would be, how do you, or what you think about the impact of military and oil complex interfering or impacting the overthrow of the Shah through the U.S. government?
Well, I don't think that, the U.S. was not involved. You're talking about the guerrilla groups. The U.S. was not supporting the guerrilla groups that overthrew the Shah, although the documents were from the Carter Library. So U.S. intelligence actually, it's very interesting. there were people in the US intelligence apparatus who were tracking this stuff, but it seemed as though it was almost like other episodes of intelligence failures we've seen recently, going back to 9/11 or beyond. There are people with the material, but who are they talking to? How are they putting the pieces together? Which officials higher up the food chain are getting that material, and are they reading it and listening to it? So I know that many Iranians believe that the US directly played a role in forcing the Shah from power, but I haven't seen any documents to show that the Carter administration wanted that to happen. Now, right at the end of the story, you will see in my book, US diplomats engaged in some maneuvering that was very ill-advised and backfires on the US in a big way, and it's a sort of catastrophic miscalculation. The question comes down to conspiracy versus incompetence. And you have to make your own choice. And one thing I like to do in my books is my readers, I put them in the judgment seat. You have to decide for yourselves whether this is the officials on both sides are acting with malice, or whether they're acting because they're not understanding the forces at work, the dynamic at work.
We have a question towards the back.
Are there any learnings from this event that might be universal and we could apply to our own government and society?
Are there any lessons?
Are there any learnings from this event that we could apply to our lives?
Well, the Arab Spring, we won't have the documents for the Arab Spring for a long time, but it would be very interesting to see how this affected the administration's decision to let Mr. Mubarak in Egypt go. I know that the fall of the Shah really affected the way the Reagan administration handled President Marcos in the Philippines. I mean, boy, he went very fast. He was off to Hawaii before, his feet would barely touch the ground. And I think, officials from the Reagan administration studied what happened, the Carter administration, how they handled the Shah. And with Marcos, it was, we got to get him out of here fast. The bleeding in Iran took place. It was a very extended period, and it really, I think officials from my readings would say that that was very destabilizing for the US national security.
We have a question right here.
Thank you so much for what you've done. It's a breath of fresh air to see someone like yourself writing to some extent closer to the truth. I was 15 when I came out before the revolution, and watching everything unfold is still depressing to see, and not viewing how the world doesn't understand what exactly has happened.
Yes.
As a historian, I'm hoping more and more people like yourself will capture what's happening in that region as far as human rights, rights of women, for a country that was moving forward in civilization, having equality throughout the country, watching it go down the drain the way it has, and have a very minimum value for women or humanity in general. What can you and other historians do to help educate media and the rest of the world, hoping that they will stop what is happening in the region? Because they're pushing more and more of the religious groups in the region that will only destroy that region.
I think that historians, as I was saying in my remarks, I think that we're entering a new wave of revisionism. I think this is going to help that process along. For example, I'm struck by how many people have said they didn't realize Iranian women had civil rights under the Shah. It's sort of interesting. I had just assumed that was known. But, and actually, I will tell you this, my editor wanted to cut out that section of the book. And we sort of went back and forth on it. And I said, no, you really have to understand that this is something that's very important for Iranians to be reminded of, that Iranian women were free to go into the workforce. They had the divorce rights. The Shah essentially gave them full and fair equality. And I know that young Iranian women in Iran today they're aware of that, and they're very interested in that. And I think that it's just a matter of writing and talking about it and having that conversation. But we're at a starting point, and it takes time. But as I said, I think the scholars are behind the curveball in a way. It does take us time to catch up. It takes 4 years to write a book like this, and that was full bore intense. And I had Iranians who knew me say, "When is the book coming out? When is the book coming out?" And it's like, well, I have to, it was 2 years full on writing and research. The editing alone was a year. The editorial process was very involved and long.
A question right here.
Thank you for the book. I've enjoyed it immensely. My question is, were there 3 pivotal events or a single pivotal event that could have prevented the revolution? I know in your book you specifically mentioned the possibility of Imam Sadr returning to Iran, and that could have prevented Khomeini's influence from spreading as a counterbalance. But besides his return specifically, is there 3 events or a single event or multiple events that could have prevented the revolution?
Well, the former officials I spoke to go back to some of them go back to the fall of '77 when the Shah really stepped up liberalization. Most people don't understand the Shah actually had a vision to democratize his country. There is this myth that he left as a dictator. In fact, the Shah had a plan to first liberalize and then democratize the country. And he announced and told the Iranian people in August '78, we are going to hold full and free and fair elections in the summer of '79, 1 year from now. And one question is, why didn't they believe him, and what happens in that year period? I think that, so liberalization and the way liberalization was not communicated to the Iranian people. There was a lot of confusion over what the Shah wanted. I think some other officials said the last chance to stop it was May '78. In the book, I outline the plan put forward by some security officials for what they told me would have been a bloodless crackdown against the unrest. That actually what you should do is have a crackdown, freeze the political environment, stabilize it for a period of a year, 2 years maybe max, but all the while you're then instituting constitutional reforms, and then you open up. Now, this is what President Sisi in Egypt is faced with. And actually, the book is supposed to be, you can draw lessons from what happened in Iran and then apply them to Egypt, and we don't know what's going to happen in Saudi Arabia. But that possible crackdown in spring of '78, when I write about these things, I'm not advocating them. I am surprised when people say, well, you're advocating a crackdown, you're advocating this. I'm putting the evidence out there. That doesn't mean I'm pushing an agenda one way or the other. There's a lot of surprising new things in the book, and I think people they need time to absorb them.
Question in the back row.
I've noticed that a lot of people that have immigrated from Iran to here, half of them will call themselves Persians, and the other will say Iran, but they only say Iran if you specifically ask them. So is that a way of divorcing themselves from what's going on in Iran and stuff, and they want to go back to the
I feel like an Iranian should be up here to answer that question. It's the same, but I mean, I think it's fair to say after the revolution, when the hostages were taken, Iranians came here, and there was a lot of abuse directed at Iranian Americans, and I think there was a reaction. Some of them felt that they would say Persian. Older Iranians would say, no, I'm Persian. I still hear that today. I get lectured to when I use the word Farsi from some Iranians who say, no, it's Persian. But other Iranians, perhaps younger ones, will say, no, it's Farsi. So it's within the community, and it depends on who you're talking to. And I'm somewhat used to it.
But question in the second row.
So much of what happened was blamed on Savak and the abuses and so on. Can you explain more of the role of Savak and in the whole process of deposing the Shah?
Yeah, I mean, even when I was working on the book, people said it's Shah Savak. I mean, that's what I get in this country from so many Americans. And the Savak is established in 1957-58 with the help of the US and Israel. That's the internal security force. The period that is very controversial is really 1971 to 76, when there is what we would describe as a dirty war going on inside Iran against subversion. The regime is faced with threats from the far left and the religious right. And the senior security forces, the officers decide that they are going to use harsh methods, including torture. And I outline in the book how that process works. And I think that led to, that decision was crossing the Rubicon in a way. And there are lessons there for other countries that go down that route, because what appears to be short-term expediency ends up long-term, I think, there's a moral issue that comes when you have the state using techniques like that against its citizens. And it's a problem the Shah couldn't resolve at the end. But I think it's also fair to say he was shielded, and there was sort of a don't ask, don't tell policy in place with him regarding Savak. Ultimately, some Iranians would say Savak failed, because they're now living here and they're not in Iran. So if Savak was supposed to safeguard the country, what happened, what went wrong?
A question towards the back.
What influenced you the most to write the book?
What was that?
What influenced you most to write the book?
I wanted to write a sequel to The Oil Kings. I always intended it to be a sequel, but I didn't tell my agent. It was always The Oil Kings ends on a note where you then want to start reading on, and that was strategic on my part, I admit. But I also wanted to do something a little different. I wanted to go inside, especially inside the palace. I really wanted to find out more about the Shah's thinking. I wanted to talk about with the people who knew him. And then I also wanted to, so really this is a book with different set pieces. You have stage sets, you have the palace, you have the White House, the US Embassy, and then you have the revolutionaries. So I always planned it that way, that you would move from one to the other, and that you would see how people were making decisions. I'm very interested in decision making, and that's what I teach at Columbia, is decision making in foreign policy. I'm very interested in how people wield power and the decisions they make based on the information they have at hand. And as we see with these books, they may do crazy things, and things we think in hindsight we don't agree with or they're foolish, but you have to also sympathize with what information they have at the time.
A question in the center.
First of all, thank you for your lecture. You mentioned that that the Shah was shielded from intelligence from Savak, but he must have had intelligence from governments that were friendly to him or that did not want to see this change. My question is, why did he not act?
Why did he not act? He acts in 1976 when he invites the Red Cross to come in. The Shah, from my understanding, the Shah was reading these reports in the foreign press about abuses and saying, this is crazy, why are we being attacked, why are we being criticized? Now, he should have taken action earlier, and instead he gets very defensive, and he's very proud, and he says, we're being needlessly criticized. But in 76, there's a turning point, and he invites the International Committee for the Red Cross in, and then he sets up his own internal investigation. And that's when the Red Cross gets back to him, and then he takes it very seriously. We have the transcripts of his meetings with human rights researchers where he understands, boy, I have a problem here, and he goes the full, that's when he essentially opens the prisons up to the Red Cross.
Question right here.
Good evening. Ajax, the project the gentleman referred to, which was the U.S. Orchestrated coup in Iran in 1953, since the statute of limitation has passed now, all the documentations are available. So if you Google Ajax, you can see everything. Anybody who wants to Google it, you'll see everything as far as what actually CIA did in Iran. However, CIA was not as much to blame because Many believe that actually the British government was behind the philosophy of it, and the reason for it was because Mossadegh got the independence of the oil from the British government.
Right.
Because British government was in Iran as a general contractor building the refinery, but then they start getting the money and channeling it to England. So when Mossadegh got the independence of the oil from the British government actually inspired CIA to do the coup. So it really was a U.S. idea to do the coup. They were just... So did you have a chance to research any of that documentation because it is available now before you wrote your book?
Well, the CIA report, yes. I mean, the CIA, in fact, I quote from the one that was declassified in 2013, The Battle for Iran. And that, you can read all the stuff on the website for the National Security Archive. They have a great resources page. But the State Department volume is not released yet. That is still under wraps. And this is a great sort of struggle that's been going on with historians and the Office of the Historian at the State Department. And on the National Security Archive homepage, the website, where you go into this resources page, you can read a column about why they think that this may be the British government. Because as you say, this plan was the inspiration of the British government and Churchill. It's a long story, but that story is certainly, there's more to be told.
We have a question in the second row.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you for being here today. I was just wondering if the Queen, Her Majesty Farah Pahlavi, or any of her family members collaborated with you on this project.
I interviewed the Queen on several occasions, a number of occasions actually. I interviewed Reza. I interviewed the Shah's surviving brother, Prince Gholam Reza. I interviewed people like the late Shah's valet and his chief of security because I wanted my readers to really understand the Shah as a person aside from the public figure, because he had been reduced, I think, to a cartoon figure. And I thought it would be interesting to see how he spent. The first chapter essentially that was the toughest chapter in the book to write, because I'm trying to recapture him as an individual. So I talked to many people, and I had to weigh up everything they said. And I looked for anecdotes that would explain his personality. And I think I came away with some pretty good anecdotes. You know, I also interviewed former President Bani Sadr and revolutionaries too. So it was also, I wanted to have different sides of the equation there. But this essentially is a book about the Shah and the King and the Queen during that last tumultuous year.
Thank you, Andrew. Please give Andrew Scott Cooper a round of applause.